Today we're going to be reviewing the Hyundai Santa Fe. Now, unlike other car reviews that would pack this thing full of boxes from Costco or take it off-road on a soccer field, we're going to be taking a look under the hood and underneath this car to see what's inside and how it works. And we're going to start under the hood where we have Hyundai's Theta 2 engine. It's a 2.4 liter inline 4-cylinder situated transversely for front-wheel drive. Now that's slightly off to the passenger side. Underneath the airbox on the driver's side, we have an 8-speed automatic transmission with all-wheel drive. Now the theme of the Santa Fe is pretty much generic and somewhat outdated. Taking a look at some of the components underneath here, we have the battery located under this airbox shroud. We've got the airbox back here, the ECU and the fuse box over here. We've got another relay box located over here, as well as the windshield washer and coolant reservoirs on this side. Now the engine used here is the same Theta 2 engine that was the subject of a major recall due to particles left in the engine during the machining process, causing the bearings to wear out and eventually fail. Now this engine is just a carryover from the previous generation. It's just a simple gasoline direct injection 4-cylinder. Now if we start with the air intake, we've got air coming through the shroud here that goes into the air box. It's then going to be filtered out, and that filtered air is going to run over to the throttle body over here and then into this plastic intake manifold. Now accessing the air filter on this is pretty easy. You just got to pop this off, pull these two tabs down, and then we can pop out the air filter. This one's pretty dirty. Now with that airbox out of the way, it really opens up a lot of space here, so we can take a look at the rest of the air intake system, including the drive-by-wire throttle body located down here. Here we have a tumble flow actuator, and what that does is it activates a series of flaps in each one of these channels here to promote tumble flow for better mixing, especially with the gasoline direct injection. And on this side of the plenum we have the variable length actuator, and it's responsible for varying the length of the intake path for better performance. Now once that air makes its way into the engine, it's then going to mix with gasoline and get burned. Now the fuel system is going to be supplied by this line coming off over here from the gas tank, and it goes directly to the direct injection pump. Now this pump is driven off of the exhaust camshaft at the back here, and is going to further pressurize the fuel and bring it back around through this line over here down to the direct injectors down below. Now if you look really closely, this shiny thing here is the fuel rail for the direct injectors underneath the intake, and there's an injector just off to this side that injects high pressure fuel directly into the piston head. Now normally if an engine just had port injection, its port injectors would be just right over here near the intake ports on the head. Now this one's just got direct injection, so that means it injects gasoline directly into the cylinders themselves, which aids with fuel economy, power, and cooling. However, the disadvantage is your valves don't get clean, and that could lead to carbon buildup. Now the direct injection pump runs off of a lobe on the camshaft at the back here, and it does get pretty noisy. That's why they have this really thick pad here that covers it. Now taking a look at the top of the engine, we do have a plastic valve cover here. We've got 4 individual ignition coils on top of the spark plugs, which is going to make for an easy spark plug change. And this engine still does take 5W20 weight oil. Most engines have switched over to 0W20 at least. Now also on top of the engine we have the PCV valve and its hose here, which will reburn any ventilation from the valve cover and crankcase and reburn it into the air intake. We've also got another tube here that goes to the air box. Now modern vehicles would integrate the PCV valve into the intake manifold, so there's no external pieces like this. Now taking a look underneath the Santa Fe, we have the front half completely covered in a black plastic cladding. Now that's great for aerodynamics and also to prevent salt water from going up inside of there causing corrosion. The back half is fairly open with the exhaust and drive shaft easily seen. Now the downside of the black plastic cladding is you got to remove it every time you do an oil change, and as you can see the fasteners are going to get lost and it just becomes an annoyance. Now taking a look underneath the engine of the Santa Fe here, we have the oil pan. Luckily it is a steel oil pan and not a plastic one. We have the oil drain plug over here, which is easy to access once that panel is removed in front of it, and we have a traditional canister style oil filter here, no messy cartridges. And just above the oil filter is the oil cooler, and it's got these 2 coolant lines that go to the engine. Not really a fan of this plastic dipstick. Seems like after a while of heat cycling it might just break off in the engine. Now taking a look at the passenger side of this engine, we have the timing cover, and underneath that we have a timing chain, which luckily does not need to be serviced as often. Now this is a double overhead cam engine, which means that we have the intake cam on this side and the exhaust cam over on this side here. Now inside of here we have continuously highly variable valve timing, which is actuated with an electric actuator through a motor over here to give you that variability in the intake cam timing. Now the exhaust side also has variable valve timing, but takes a more traditional approach by using a typical oil control valve to control its actuator. Now just below the timing cover is the accessory belt, and you can see that there really isn't that much room between the frame of the vehicle and these pulleys. This here is a tensioner pulley, so in order to change this drive belt, you'd have to come in here with your special service tool and turn this tensioner up to release its tension, and then you can slip the belt off. Now also attached to the belts is the alternator, and it is pretty easy to access from the top here. Now here's a look at the AC compressor from down below and its drive belt. Now accessing it shouldn't be too difficult. You have these two easy bolts at the bottom here. It's also got a bracket bolted to the oil pan, and then there's a couple of bolts that are a little bit more harder at the top there. Now this engine does have two drive belts. You've got the water pump belt located at the back there, and then the alternator and AC compressor belts at the front here. I like how they left a little peephole in the splash guard here to turn the engine over. I wish they did that for the oil filter. Now the Santa Fe has two main engine mounts, one over here on the passenger side connected to its frame wheel, and the other one over here on the driver's side connected to the transmission. There's also one down further at the back. And here's a look at that rear mount that bolts the transmission to the subframe. And we're going to have a listen to the engine at startup. Now in general, just above the subframe, there seems to be a lot of room back here behind the transmission. I wonder if they originally designed this to fit a V6. Now under the hood of the Santa Fe, there isn't a lot of electronics and wiring, which is probably going to lend to its simplicity and ultimate reliability in the long term. Now to make things simple, they've put the ECU underneath the hood here, which I typically don't like because it's susceptible to any water damage or any collision damage, and it's pretty expensive to replace. Now just beside it, we have this fuse box here, which is pretty easy to access all of the fuels and relays that are in this vehicle, and it does come with a glass mat battery, which should last pretty long. And I think everyone will agree that Hyundai has done a really distinctive job with the headlights here, the top one being the DRL, then the headlight, high beam, and then the fog light down below. But if you actually take a look at what's going on behind here, the DRL is its own separate piece, and that's powered by this little wire over here. And then further down below that, we have the headlight, and it's got the high beam and low beam lights over here. That's pretty easy to access on the driver's side at least. And if not, you can just open the splash guard over here to access them. Now I wish it was just as clear on the passenger side, but because you've got this washer tank in the way, things are a little bit tighter to access the bulbs inside of here. And here's a look at that stack of headlights from down below. Now I don't really like this electrical connector that they've got here. It's kind of exposed and looks pretty raw. Now one of the trends I'm finding on a lot of newer vehicles is the front radiator support is made of a composite plastic instead of a metal, and that also means that you can't use this as a jack point. Instead you've got to jack it up way at the back here where we have the subframe. Now this subframe is made of steel, as you can see, and it only runs along the back of the engine bay and ties the two wheels together. There really isn't anything structural ahead of the subframe all the way out to the front of the vehicle. Now here's something interesting. There is no rear rebar on the Santa Fe. In fact, it just uses this plastic here that's reinforced, and that's what's bolted over here to the flange frames. So if someone rear ends you and this plastic cracks, you got to replace this whole thing. Now when it comes to the transmission, Hyundai has taken a very traditional approach and just put an 8-speed automatic in here instead of a CVT. It's even shifted by this old school cable instead of an electric dial on the dashboard and a motor to control the gear. Now just below the battery, if we move the lower radiator hose out of the way, you can see this here is the valve body. It's actually got a pan on the front of the engine as opposed to underneath, and it's going to contain the ECU for the computer as well as all the solenoids to switch your gears. And here's a look at that 8-speed automatic transmission from down below. You can see we've got the plastic valve body cover here, which basically replaces a transmission oil pan down below. We have the drain plug located over here, and we've got a transmission cooler up inside of here that has these coolant lines leading to it. Now I like this design better because instead of having transmission fluid move from the transmission over to the radiator to get cooled off, you instead bring the coolant over to this cooler over here, so the transmission fluid has less chance of leaking out in other places. Now looking at the transmission from the driver's side, you can see this car does have a leak of some sort, and this car only has 40,000 kilometers. Anyway, behind the transmission we have this body over here that houses the differential for the front wheels, and thus the axles that go to the front on this side and over on that side. And if I follow that differential housing, it leads over here to the transfer case. Now here we've got the transfer case for the H-TRAC all-wheel drive system. Now what it does is it's going to take some torque that goes from that front differential and transfer it out to the rear wheels through this rear drive shaft over here, and it does that using a hydroelectric clutch, which is going to actuate depending on the drive mode you're in and the road conditions. Other than that, this doesn't really engage the rear wheels, and it's mostly a front wheel drive vehicle. And what I find interesting is that these drive shaft bolts go directly into the output flange from the transfer case. There's no lock nuts or anything on the other side, it just threads right in. Now that drive shaft is then going to take its rotational power along the length of the middle of the vehicle out to the rear differential. Now that rear drive shaft is going to come up to the rear differential here and split the power to the rear wheel. Now on the rear differential we have an electric motor, and that serves to disconnect the power coming from the driveline to limit your driveline losses. Now servicing the rear differential is straightforward. You have a drain port over here and a fill port over here. Now coming off the rear differential going into the hub, we have this long slender axle, and you can see that it's fairly thin, and that tells you that this vehicle will not take too much power in the rear, maybe up to about 50%. Now for those of you wondering, changing the starter on one of these is probably the hardest job, because you got to remove the entire intake at the top there in order to access it underneath. It's really tight inside of there. Now the front suspension on the Santa Fe, just like the rest of the car, is pretty basic and old school, but that also makes it really easy to maintain. It's a McPherson style strut suspension. You have your stabilizer link located over here. It's nice and long, and it comes down to the stabilizer bar at the front here. Looking further down here, we have the CV axle, and then you've got a stamped steel lower control arm at the bottom here with an easy to access bolt over here. There's nothing like an engine mount blocking the way. And looking at the back here, we have the inner and the outer tie rod. This does look pretty thin for an SUV. You have your stamped steel lower control arm, and this bolt here is pretty easy to access from down below, so that's pretty easy to swap out. Now down at the bottom here, things get even better because you've got a bolt-on style ball joint, which means that you don't need a press to change it out. Now because the knuckle itself is made of aluminum, the wheel bearing bolts onto it. Now strangely, it does use these Torx bolts, but you don't need a press to change it out, which is good. Now the rear suspension on the Santa Fe is a little bit more complicated than the front, which means that it will cost you a little bit more on maintenance, but it is much better for handling. At the back here we have a multi-link suspension. So we've got the upper control arm here, we have the control blade or the trailing arm over here, and then just behind that control blade we have the front lower control arm. It's just covered in a plastic shell, but it is made of metal. Taking a look at the rear lower control arm, it's made of stamped steel, and it's going to take the weight of the spring and the rebound of the shock that's bolted to it. Now because the rear knuckles are aluminum, you do use bolt-on bearings, but again with these Torx bolts. Now replacing the shocks on the Santa Fe shouldn't be too difficult. Just 2 bolts at the top here, no need to go into the interior, and then 1 bolt down at the lower controller. And here we've got the rear stabilizer link and its sway bar that goes over to the other side. It bolts to this lower control arm over here underneath. Now upgrading the rear sway bar on this thing is going to be a little difficult because we do have the bushing where it mounts here, but it then goes up above the rear differential before going back out to the other side. And here's a look at that multi-link suspension from underneath. You could see that the bolt-on bearing over there uses 4 bolts. We've also got the connection over here that goes to the body for the control blade. Now the rear subframe on the Santa Fe is made of stamped steel. It's not aluminum. Now the braking system on the Santa Fe is pretty old school. Just uses a simple master cylinder with 2 lines coming off of it and a vacuum assisted brake booster. And that brake booster is just powered off of the air intake. There's not even a vacuum pump like some other modern vehicles. Other competitors like the Ford Escape actually make this whole thing electrified. Now if you follow the brake lines from the master cylinder, it goes over here to the ABS actuator, which is responsible for the stability, traction, as well as autonomous braking features. Now speaking of autonomous braking, this is where the millimeter radar sensor is located, below the front license plate. 1 little smack on this and it's going to be a small fortune to replace. Other competitors like Toyota actually put it inside of the front emblem. Now the front brakes on the Santa Fe are very simple, just a single piston floating caliper over here and a disc rotor. Now surprisingly, the rear brakes on the Santa Fe are a little bit more interesting than the front brakes. It still uses a single piston caliper and it uses a solid disc rotor instead of a ventilated one. But what really is new is an electric parking brake actuator attached to the caliper over here. So when you hit the parking brakes, it's going to power up this thing and it's going to squeeze this together to stop the car from rolling away. Next up, we're going to look at the cooling system on the Santa Fe. Now it's pretty traditional. We've got a coolant jug located over here, and it's going to lead up to this radiator cap at the top here. And this isn't the turbo model, so there's just a single radiator cap. There's not multiple circuits going on here. Now hot coolant is going to make its way from the engine up to the upper radiator hose here and into the radiator, where it's going to get cooled cooled off. Now there's one single giant electric fan that cools everything off at the front of this vehicle. The coolant is then going to travel through the lower radiator hose back up into the engine here. And here's a look at how giant that coolant fan is from down below. Now that lower radiator hose is then going to lead up to this plastic thermostat housing that houses the thermostat. It's basically the cooling central for this engine where all the hoses lead off of it, including the heater hoses. We've got a water pump hose that comes across the back of the engine and feeds here. We've got the upper radiator hose as well as coolant hoses for the throttle body, oil cooler, and transmission cooler. Now perhaps the most old school thing with this Hyundai engine is it still uses a mechanical water pump. A lot of newer cars are switching over to electric water pumps. Now this one here is driven off of the drive belt, and it doesn't really feed the cooling system directly. There's actually a bypass hose behind the exhaust manifold that takes the coolant over to the other side. Now here's a look at the back of the water pump. You can see it just dangles off the back of the engine like an afterthought that it has to be driven off of the drive belt. It's then going to send its fluid through this little pipe over here that goes over to the other side of the engine where the cooling happens. Now I really like how Hyundai's put this flat plastic piece here so that you can rest your tools here and nothing's going to fall off. However, that also means that you have to remove the entire front bumper assembly if you want to access the radiator. Now looking at the Santa Fe's power steering system, it is an electric unit where we have the motor further buried up underneath the dash on the column. It then leads up to this pinion gear over here where it joins to the steering rack. The rack itself is mounted to the subframe, and then that goes out to the tie rods to push the wheels. Now looking up to the steering column from the fuse box inside the vehicle, you could see the power steering assist motor. Now taking a look at the exhaust system on the Santa Fe, it's just a typical steel exhaust manifold mounted to the head. It's not integrated into the head like newer vehicles or turbo models. It's then going to send exhaust gases down through the catalytic converter and then into the flex pipe down below. Now from underneath you can barely make out the catalytic converter underneath the heat shield there. The exhaust is then going to transfer out through this flex pipe and then out through the tailpipe to the back. Now, this car is not even 2 years old and the exhaust is really falling apart here. You can see all the rust crusting off. It's what Canadian winters do to you. Now the exhaust is then going to travel through this mid resonator over here and then out to the rear muffler and then out through a real tailpipe. Now the Santa Fe uses an asymmetrical metal gas tank, so it's actually lower on the driver's side here, but then it goes up on the passenger side over here to clear for the exhaust. So that means if you got a full tank of gas, your driver's side of your car is going to be weighing a little bit more. At least Hyundai is nice enough to give you a real spare tire. You can see this is the windy mechanism that you activate from inside to drop this tire down on the ground. Here's a look at the washer tank from down below. Now they've kind of cheated by using a single pump with two outlets that go to the front and the rear window washer. Now as a fellow Canadian, I see a lot of uncovered steel underneath this car, so I highly recommend that you get rust proofing, because there's no undercoating or nothing from the factory protecting this. Now in terms of build quality, the Hyundai Santa Fe does have its fair share of plastics under the hood, but it's not any worse than its Japanese competition. However, I am quite disappointed with the mechanicals of this car. That's basically a carried over powertrain from almost 10 years ago, and nothing new has really changed with this reskin for 2019. Now a lot of manufacturers have added a lot of new technology under the hood to enhance economy as well as the scale of mass production. However, that goes well for this vehicle because it's pretty simple overall, which should make it fairly reliable if you want to keep this thing long term. Now given that, I can understand why Hyundai has only kept this setup for 2 model years and is completely changing the powertrain and the platform for 2021. And that's pretty much a wrap on the new Hyundai Santa Fe. Make sure you follow me on Instagram to find out what the next car review is going to be, and subscribe for more videos just like this one.